I still remember that evening in San Francisco, like it's burned into the back of my eyelids, the kind of memory you can't shake off, no matter how many years pass, or how much you try to bury it under everyday noise. I wasn't supposed to be there, not really. A neighbor of mine, Carol, had pulled me into the city for dinner after weeks of telling me I spent too much time alone, and she insisted on showing me this restaurant in the financial district that everyone in her office raved about. It was one of those places where the silverware feels heavier than it should, where the lighting is dim on purpose, and the waiters float around like they're part of the wallpaper, trained to be invisible. I never felt like I belonged in places like that, but I went anyway, mostly for her. When we walked in, you couldn't miss him, Charles Davenport. If you've lived in California long enough, his name was impossible to escape. It came up in headlines, in real estate deals, in whispers about court cases that somehow always bent in his favor. He had that look about him, the kind of face that didn't need to smile to make people nervous. He sat like a shadow that had taken human form, perfectly still in a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than I'd made in 3 months. I caught myself holding my breath when I realized who he was, even though he'd never notice a woman like me at the next table. But it wasn't him that froze me in place. It was the boy beside him, maybe 9 years old, seated in a wheelchair so sleek it looked more like a machine than a chair. He had the sweetest face, soft eyes that seemed too gentle to belong to a family like that, eyes that looked like they were always waiting for something, for permission, for kindness, for hope. I later learned his name was Michael, though everyone called him Mikey. 5 years earlier, after a car accident, he had lost the use of his legs. The world's finest doctors had tried and failed, and his father's money had done nothing to change the outcome. He sat quietly, stirring the ice in his drink with a straw, like he'd already grown used to disappointment. Charles, on the other hand, couldn't stand even the smallest delay. I watched him glance at his watch 3 times in less than 5 minutes, his finger tapping against the table with a sharp rhythm that reminded me of a clock running out of patience. It wasn't about the food, not really. The wait wasn't long. It was about him, about how the world was supposed to bend to his schedule. A young waiter, barely more than a boy himself, scurried over to reassure him, his face pale with nerves, like he knew one wrong word could end his night. Charles didn't respond, not even with a nod, just exhaled through his nose and looked away, his jaw tightening, as though silence was punishment enough. The whole room seemed to orbit around him, as though the chandeliers dimmed a little when he shifted in his chair, as though the conversations at other tables shrank into whispers out of respect or fear. And then something happened that silenced even that muted buzz. Out of nowhere, this little girl appeared, maybe 9 or 10, her dark hair tied back in braids, her feet bare against the marble floor. She wasn't dressed for a place like that. She looked like she had wandered in from another world entirely. And yet she walked with such certainty, straight between the tables crowded with expensive wine glasses and designer handbags, as if none of it intimidated her in the least. I can still hear Carol beside me, clutching her purse and muttering, "Where on earth did she come from?" A man at another table whispered to his wife to call security. The waiters hesitated, torn between doing their job and freezing in place. But the girl didn't stop, didn't even glance sideways. She walked right up to Charles Davenport's table, looked him square in the eye with a calmness that made even me sit straighter, and in a voice that was steady and clear, she said, "Give me something to eat, and I'll heal your son." What struck me about Charles Davenport that night wasn't just his wealth, or the way the whole room seemed to lean in his direction, but how he could make impatience feel like a weapon. The food was on time, maybe even early by normal standards, but for a man like him, every second that didn't fold neatly into his expectations was an offense. The poor waiter, a boy who looked no older than my nephew, hurried over with this nervous smile and whispered that the dishes would be ready in just another minute. Charles didn't bother to answer. He just turned his face away, pressed his lips tight, and blew air out of his nose like he was exhausted by the existence of anyone less efficient than himself. I couldn't take my eyes off Mikey, though. He sat across from his father, quiet as a shadow, twirling his straw in a glass of orange juice. There was something heartbreaking in how unbothered he looked, as if he had already trained himself to expect nothing more than silence and waiting. It wasn't the silence of a child daydreaming, but the silence of someone who's been taught that their needs are always secondary. And maybe that was what unsettled me most. This boy didn't look sad or disappointed, just used to it. Used to being overlooked in a world where his father's time mattered more than his smile. Around them, the entire restaurant moved in a kind of ritual. People didn't just glance at Charles, they adjusted their posture when they realized who he was, as if simply existing in his presence required discipline. It reminded me of church when I was a girl, when Mrs. Bennet, the neighbor who taught Sunday school, used to say the air grows heavier when God steps into the room. Except here, it wasn't holiness that pressed on everyone's chest. It was fear, or maybe awe of power. Charles bought companies like other people bought groceries, and everyone seemed to know it. That night, though, something happened that shattered that strange ceremony. From the top of the marble staircase, through the grand entrance, came a little girl. At first, I thought maybe she was part of some performance, some planned surprise, but the longer I looked, the more I realized she didn't belong to this place. She wore the kind of simple clothes you'd expect to see at a playground, her hair braided into two uneven plaits, her feet bare on that polished floor. Her eyes, Lord, her eyes. They were so dark and wide, they reminded me of the night sky on the farm where I grew up, the kind without stars, where the darkness itself felt alive. She didn't creep or hesitate the way you'd expect a child to in a place like that. She walked with a steadiness that almost felt like defiance, moving between the tables as if she were cutting across an open field, untouched by the stares, the gasps, the whispers. I heard a woman behind me clutch her purse and mutter, "Where on earth did she come from?" Another man leaned into his wife's ear and hissed, "Security," while the waiter froze, torn between stepping in and pretending not to notice. But the girl didn't stop, didn't look left or right. She just kept walking straight toward the Davenport table, toward that wall of silence, as if she had known all along that was exactly where she belonged. Her steps were so soft you could barely hear them against the marble, but somehow each one landed with a weight that pushed through the room. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way she walked, like every inch of polished floor was hers to claim. That restaurant, with its shelves of rare wines, its crisp linen tablecloths, its guests dressed in designer suits and jewelry, all of it suddenly felt fragile, as if the real challenge wasn't between money and status, but between this little barefoot girl and the world that thought it was untouchable. When she finally reached their table, she stopped, and I swear to you, the way she looked at them, it was as though she already knew their story. She turned those dark eyes toward Mikey, and he lifted his gaze so slowly, like he was afraid to believe in whatever he saw. For a heartbeat, he seemed suspended between fear and wonder, his little chest rising as if he had to remind himself to breathe. I thought of my own son at that age, how he would look at me when he wanted reassurance, and the sight of Mikey's hesitation hit me harder than I expected. Charles, though, was another story. He arched one eyebrow the way only men with too much power know how to do, already shaping the words he used to slice people down to size. I'd seen that look in boardrooms back when I worked corporate, the way my old boss, Mr. Lane, could humiliate a whole team with nothing more than a dry comment. I knew Charles was about to unleash that same cutting tone, the one that fired executives and left them broken in the same breath. But then, before he could open his mouth, the girl spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a clear bell in a storm, firm, steady, absolutely sure of itself. She said, "Give me something to eat, and I'll heal your son." And the whole place collapsed into silence, but not the kind of silence you get in business meetings or awkward dinners. This was heavier, denser, like the chandeliers themselves were holding their light back, unsure if they should even be shining on something that felt this raw, this impossible. I felt the hairs rise on my arms, and I wasn't the only one. People set down their glasses mid-sip, forks hovered in midair, and no one dared to cough or whisper. The girl didn't flinch. She just stood there, her gaze locked on Charles, as if she hadn't said something outrageous, as if she'd simply stated a fact of the universe. And Mikey, oh, that boy didn't blink. His eyes were wide, too wide, filling with something I couldn't quite name but could feel in my own chest. Hope so fragile you're scared to touch it. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize the world just shifted, even if no one understands how yet. What broke my heart in that moment wasn't the arrogance in Charles Davenport's voice, though there was plenty of that, but the way his son looked at the girl. Mikey's eyes had that glimmer I hadn't seen in him all evening, the kind of fragile hope that feels too precious to exist in a world so sharp-edged. You could see it, you could feel it, and I thought maybe, just maybe, his father might soften for a breath. But Charles didn't. His face darkened, and I swear you could almost hear the blood boiling in his veins. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into this bitter smile that wasn't really a smile at all, and he muttered, "This must be a joke." The words came out dripping with venom. He turned toward the girl, his voice rising, sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? Heal my son? With what, your filthy little hand?" The way he said it made my stomach twist, because she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just stood there, holding his stare like she had every right to be there. That stillness of hers infuriated him more than any outburst could have. I've seen men like him my whole life, the ones who could buy their way out of anything, but who couldn't stand when someone, especially someone small and powerless, refused to bow down. He kept going, louder now, not even pretending to care about the audience around him. "What is this, some kind of reality show? You think you know more than the best doctors on this planet? I've paid for 5 years of specialists, experts, geniuses, and not one of them could give my boy back a single step. And you," his voice cracked into a near shout, "you think you can stroll in here and fix him?" His fury filled the room so completely it drowned out the clinking glasses, the quiet music, even the murmurs at other tables. It was like watching a storm roll in, violent and unstoppable. Then came the smallest gesture, but it nearly unraveled me. Mikey, sweet, quiet Mikey, reached out and tugged at his father's hand. His voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear it. "Dad, just listen to her." For half a second, I thought maybe Charles would. Maybe he'd feel the plea in that child's touch. But no, he yanked his hand away as though it burned him, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing. "No, Mikey. This is a scam. She's just another one of those people who profit off pain. She wants to trick us." And then came the moment that made everyone in the restaurant stiffen. He slammed his fist against the table so hard the silverware rattled. His voice boomed, "Waiter!" The poor young man froze halfway between tables. "Get this farce out of here before I throw her out myself." The words cracked through the silence, cruel and absolute. And the waiter, God bless him, stood paralyzed, torn between obeying the most powerful man in the city and protecting a little barefoot girl who hadn't done anything but speak with courage. No one in that restaurant knew what to do. You could feel it in the way every head tilted just slightly, in the nervous shuffle of the maître d' who had probably spent his career bowing to billionaires and movie stars, but suddenly looked like a lost child himself. She was only a girl, thin as a reed, barefoot in a place where people wore $1,000 shoes, and yet her voice carried more certainty than any man in that room. And maybe that was the most unsettling part, that she didn't sound like she was asking permission. She sounded like she already knew the truth. Then she spoke again, and this time her words weren't for Charles, they were for Mikey. "I'm not lying," she said, steady as a heartbeat. "Can I give you a little proof?" The way she locked eyes with that boy, I swear it was like the room folded down to just the two of them. Charles started to move, his mouth twitching with protest, but she was faster. One small step forward, and she was there, at his side, close enough for her shadow to touch his wheelchair. Her bare feet hardly whispered against the marble, but her movement held a kind of quiet grace that made the chandeliers seem clumsy in comparison. And then she did the unthinkable. She lowered herself to her knees before him. Not in worship, not in pity, but with the gentle steadiness of someone who believed entirely in what they were about to do. She laid her hand on his legs. It wasn't the clinical touch of a doctor, sterile and distant, and it wasn't the heavy gesture of religion either. It was simple, human, the kind of touch you give when you believe in something so deeply that your body becomes an instrument for it. I watched Mikey's face. At first, nothing, then the faintest shiver, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking directly at him. His chest expanded with a deeper breath. His fingers curled slightly as if something inside had stirred. But there was no dramatic miracle, no burst of light, no music swelling from nowhere. Just a strange pause, a suspension of air, as if the whole room was leaning forward on its toes, waiting for the world to reveal itself. And when it didn't, not yet, the girl pulled her hand away with quiet respect, stood, and took a single step back. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "Sometimes it takes a few minutes." That was all she said, and I swear the weight of it pressed harder on Charles than any insult ever could. He exploded, all restraint gone, his fury tearing through the fragile silence she'd created. His voice, his anger, his disbelief, it came crashing down like thunder in a room that had just learned what stillness felt like. It was like watching a dam burst. All that polished restraint Charles had been holding onto snapped in an instant. He shot up from his chair so violently the stemware rattled, and the couple at the next table flinched. His voice cracked open, raw and furious. "That's it? That's your big trick?" he shouted, his words cutting through the hush of the restaurant like broken glass. "You touch his legs and expect us to believe? My son is still paralyzed. Do you understand? He's not going to walk just because you laid your hand on him." The cruelty in his tone made the room shrink. I've heard men be harsh before, but this was different. This wasn't businesslike dismissal or cold efficiency. This was humiliation, delivered with the precision of someone who wanted to crush whatever fragile courage stood in front of him. You could see it in the way people froze mid-bite, the way the waiter standing near the bar dropped his towel and bent to pick it up just to hide his face. Even the chandeliers above seemed to flicker as if they didn't want to cast light on what was unfolding. The girl didn't argue. She didn't cry, didn't run, didn't even quicken her pace. She simply lowered her head, turned, and walked away with the same quiet determination she had entered with. And I'll tell you, that was harder to watch than any outburst would have been, because she didn't look defeated. She looked like someone who had already done what she came to do, whether Charles could see it or not. She walked toward the entrance with her braids swinging softly against her back, and it felt like she carried something with her, or maybe she left something behind, an echo none of us could name. Charles collapsed back into his chair, his fists clenched tight on the linen tablecloth, breathing like he'd just run a race he hadn't won. He didn't look victorious, he looked haunted, though he'd never admit it. Across from him, Mikey stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the doorway where the girl had disappeared. There was something new in them, not relief exactly, but a kind of brightness, like he'd felt something pass through him that his body hadn't yet learned how to explain. I caught myself staring at him, my chest tight with an emotion I couldn't place. It wasn't pity, it was closer to awe. When the food finally arrived, the poor waiter set the plates down like he wished he could vanish. His hands shook, and he avoided meeting anyone's eyes, already regretting he hadn't tripped in the kitchen to delay this moment longer. The air, once filled with soft chatter and the hum of background music, had thickened into something sharp and suffocating. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was the kind of stillness that settles after something violent, unnecessary, and irreversible has taken place. And sitting there, I realized none of us would forget it, no matter how quickly the wine started flowing again. Charles sat stiff and rigid, his fists still pressed into the white tablecloth like he was bracing himself against an earthquake only he could feel. His jaw was tight, his gaze locked on some invisible point across the room, but it wasn't the stare of a man in control. No, there was no triumph in him now, just the shadow of someone who'd gone too far, but couldn't bring himself to admit it. I've seen that look before. Men who win arguments but lose their souls in the process. Across the table, Mikey held his fork, but his hand trembled, and he couldn't bring it to his mouth. His little chest rose and fell in a rhythm that didn't match the quiet stillness of the room. Something was happening inside him. You could feel it, even before he said a word. Slowly, almost carefully, he set the fork down, let his hands fall into his lap, and stared down at his legs. He frowned, the kind of puzzled expression a child makes when the world suddenly breaks its own rules. And then, so quietly I barely caught it, he whispered, "Dad." Charles didn't move. He was too busy wrestling with his own fury, still clinging to it like it was armor. But Mikey tried again, this time his voice a little stronger, though trembling with both fear and wonder. "Dad, my legs feel hot." The words hung in the air, uncertain and delicate, but they landed with the weight of something holy. I felt my own breath catch in my throat. That made Charles turn, slowly at first, like he didn't want to believe he'd heard correctly. His eyes, usually so sharp and cold, now carried a flicker of something else. Disbelief, maybe even fear. "What do you mean, hot?" he asked, his voice low, almost broken. And then I watched Mikey, with hands that had known nothing but stillness for 5 years, press his fingers to his own knee. He swallowed hard, his eyes wide, and said, "I feel it. I really feel it." The words didn't come out smooth. They stumbled, uneven and raw, like they had been locked away for too long and were fighting their way back into the world. Charles leaned forward suddenly, his chair creaking under him, and cupped his son's face with both hands as if to anchor him. His voice cracked with desperation. "Say it again. Tell me again." And there it was, a boy trembling with the impossible, a father trembling with the fear of believing it, and me, sitting at the edge of my seat, feeling like I had just witnessed the first crack in the wall that had kept their lives frozen for years. I swear the whole room froze when Mikey whispered those words. His little voice shook, but the conviction in it was unmistakable. "Dad, it tingles. My legs. They tingle." He said it again, a little stronger this time, like he needed to convince himself it was real. "It's faint, but I can feel something." You could have heard a pin drop. For 5 years that boy's body had been silent, and now he was telling us it had spoken again. Charles recoiled like the words had punched him straight in the gut. All the arrogance, all the sneering disbelief he'd clung to, it fell apart in an instant. He wasn't the powerful man everyone feared anymore. He was just a father hearing the impossible from his son's lips. His face crumbled in a way I didn't think a man like him could crumble. For the first time, I saw fear and wonder battling inside him. Then, with a suddenness that made me jump, he shot out of his chair so fast the heavy wooden thing toppled backward onto the marble floor. The crash echoed, and waiters flinched as though they'd been caught in the blast of an explosion. People at nearby tables turned openly now, no longer pretending not to watch. But Charles didn't see them. He didn't see anyone. He snatched his jacket from the back of the chair, tossed a wad of bills onto the table without even looking, and bolted. It wasn't a graceful exit. It was desperate, frantic. I followed him with my eyes as he shoved past startled diners and burst through the glass doors into the sunlight. Outside, the California heat shimmered against the pavement, and I could see him scanning wildly, his head jerking from side to side, his eyes wide with something close to panic. He staggered onto the sidewalk like a man chasing a ghost. And then he shouted, loud enough that people on the street stopped and stared. "Girl! Where are you? Girl!" The words tore out of him, raw and pleading, as if the weight of his entire life hung on whether she answered. He ran to the corner, spun one way, then the other, his suit jacket flapping, his breath ragged. He darted across the street against the light, horns blaring, a cab screeching so close I thought it might hit him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He kept calling out, voice cracking, desperation dripping from every syllable, and in that moment, watching him from behind the restaurant's gleaming windows, I realized something I'll never forget. This man who had built his world on power and fear was unraveling in front of strangers because of a barefoot child who had offered nothing more than a touch and a promise. I watched him from the doorway, and I'll never forget the way Charles looked as he stumbled down that sidewalk, spinning his head in every direction like a man who'd lost more than just his bearings. He wasn't searching with strategy, not with the cold efficiency of the businessman people feared. He was searching like a father who had finally realized he'd thrown away the only chance that mattered. His voice cracked as he called out, louder at first, then softer, breaking apart at the edges. He shouted for her, begged her, his words bouncing off the concrete walls of the plaza across the street until all that came back was the echo of his own desperation. He crossed into the square, weaving between benches and trees, peering into every shadow as though she might materialize if he just looked hard enough. But there was nothing, no small figure, no flash of braids, no trace of bare feet on hot pavement, only the faint reflection of his own frantic movements in the glass storefronts, and the sharp sound of his shoes pounding against the stone. Sweat rolled down his temples, soaking into the collar of his shirt, and still he didn't stop. It was as though his body couldn't allow him to, not now, not after the moment had slipped through his fingers. At one point he slowed, his chest heaving, his voice dropping into a whisper. "Please come back," he said, and for the first time since I'd ever seen him, there was no arrogance, no control, no performance, just a broken man whispering into the heat of the day. I had goosebumps listening to it because I realized this was the voice of someone who had built his life on never begging anyone for anything. And now he was pleading with a child who owed him nothing. What seemed to haunt him most, though, wasn't just that she was gone. It was the brutal awareness that he had done this to himself. He had pushed her away, treated her like dirt under his shoe, mocked her as if she were a scam or a nuisance. And yet, she had been right there, close enough to touch, willing to offer something no amount of money or power could buy. That knowledge pressed down on him heavier than the California sun beating against his back, heavier than the shame of strangers staring as he unraveled in public. By the time he staggered back into the restaurant, his eyes wild and empty, the table was no longer the same. The plates had gone cold, the glasses half drained, and Mikey sat quietly by the window, staring out at the street with tears brimming in his eyes. He didn't ask where she went. He didn't need to. The boy knew, the way children always seem to know, that the moment had slipped away, and what lingered wasn't relief or joy. It was the aching silence of something sacred that had been offered and thrown aside. When I came back inside, the table looked like a crime scene after the storm had passed. The food sat untouched, cooling under the weight of silence. Mikey didn't reach for his fork, didn't even glance at the plates. He just kept staring out the window, his small shoulders rigid, his lips pressed together. Tears brimmed in his eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness exactly. They were different, deeper, like he was holding on to something no one else in the room could understand. "She's gone, isn't she?" he finally asked, his gaze fixed on the street as though he might still catch sight of her. The question cracked something open in the room, in me, in his father. Charles lowered himself back into his chair, and for once, there was no fight left in him. He dragged his hands down his face, like he was trying to wipe away the man he had been just an hour before, the man who had laughed at miracles and pushed them aside. His voice was low, almost broken, when he said, "She was real, son, and I didn't see it. That was all. There was nothing else to add, because what words could fill the space of a miracle you'd thrown away?" The days that followed stripped him bare. Charles Davenport, the untouchable giant of San Francisco, the man who could buy silence with a signature, he unraveled before our eyes. He stalked the city streets like a man possessed, driven not by power anymore, but by guilt that chewed at him until there was nothing left but bone and shadow. He hired private investigators, threw money in every direction, demanded access to security footage from restaurants, subway stations, parks. He bribed bus terminal clerks, pressed crumpled bills into the hands of janitors, hovered outside shelters with bloodshot eyes. He didn't sleep, not really, Nights bled into mornings, mornings bled into nights, and his body grew thinner, weaker, as if each hour without answers carved another piece out of him. He forgot to eat, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. I remember one night catching a glimpse of him in the financial district, standing under the flickering light of a street lamp, phone pressed to his ear, his voice shaking with hysteria. He wasn't giving orders anymore, he was begging. Every call sounded more desperate than the last, every plea carrying the weight of a man who finally knew money had limits. It was eerie, almost unbearable, to watch someone who had built his life on control slip into chaos. Each time the phone rang and he answered, his tone cracked a little more, his words spilling out ragged and raw. "Find her," he'd repeat. "Please, find her." His empire was still standing, but Charles himself was crumbling, undone not by competitors or scandal, but by the ghost of a barefoot child he couldn't let go. "I'll pay whatever it takes, just find her." That was the line I heard him repeat over and over again in those days, his voice raw, frayed at the edges, stripped of the authority it once carried. He described her so many times it became like a prayer. "She's about 9 years old, dark hair, dark eyes, piercing eyes. You'll know her when you see her." And every time he said it, you could hear the hunger in him, like he was chasing something he couldn't live without. He begged them to comb the streets, to check shelters, to leave no corner unsearched. The city kept moving. People still went to work, still laughed at cafes, still complained about traffic on the Bay Bridge. But for Charles, the world had collapsed into a single obsession. It was as if he had dug himself into a pit so deep that no amount of money could build a ladder high enough to climb out. He walked those streets like a ghost, thinner every day, his once iron posture folding under the weight of guilt. And in the middle of it all was Mikey, clinging to his father's unraveling edges, carrying his own quiet ache. For one fleeting moment, hope had stirred in that boy's body. I saw it myself. The way his toes twitched under the blanket one morning, the way his lips curled into a smile he hadn't worn in years. "Dad, it's warm again," he whispered, his voice brimming with wonder. And for a heartbeat, everything felt possible. But then, like sand slipping through fingers, it was gone. His legs went cold again, heavy, unresponsive. The miracle had flickered and vanished, leaving behind not just silence but devastation. Charles nearly lost his mind. "It can't be coincidence," he muttered endlessly, pacing the living room until the carpet wore thin. "She started something, and I pushed her away." By the end of that week, he was a wreck. Sleepless nights carved hollows under his eyes, and he'd stopped pretending to eat. His house, that immaculate mansion in Pacific Heights, felt like a prison echoing with footsteps that never rested. I think he had nearly given up when the phone finally rang one icy night. He snatched it up on the first ring, and his voice cracked just saying hello. On the other end, one of the investigators he'd hired spoke quickly, almost nervously. "Mr. Davenport, we found a girl matching your description. She's in a shelter up north, with her mother." Before the man could finish, Charles was already moving. The phone slipped from his hand onto the couch, his coat was off the rack, the car keys clenched so tight in his fist, I thought the metal might cut his skin. He didn't even grab a wallet. He didn't need it. In that instant, he wasn't the billionaire people bowed to. He was just a desperate father, running on nothing but guilt and the wild hope that he might have one more chance. By the time he pulled up to the shelter, he hardly looked like the man who once ruled boardrooms and silenced rivals with a glance. His face was drawn and hollow, his eyes sunk deep in their sockets, and a scruff of beard clung unevenly to his jaw. The polished armor of Charles Davenport was gone. What stood there was just a father stripped of power, clutching at a chance he didn't deserve. The shelter itself was small and tired, its paint peeling from the walls, the concrete steps worn thin by years of footsteps. Even from the outside, it smelled faintly of bleach and dampness, a smell I still can't forget. The staff met him at the door with suspicion. Who wouldn't? A man in a sleek black car showing up unannounced late at night, demanding entry. Their faces carried the guarded caution of people who've seen promises broken too many times. But when he pulled out the paper with her name, her description, their hesitation cracked. They let him pass, though their eyes followed him with wary judgment as he moved down those narrow hallways. The corridors were lined with children's drawings taped crookedly to the walls, suns with smiling faces, stick figures holding hands, uneven rainbows drawn in crayon. Broken toys lay forgotten in corners, and thin mattresses crowded the floors of rooms where laughter had long ago given way to survival. The air was heavy with disinfectant, sharp and artificial, doing little to hide the musty damp that clung to everything. Each step he took seemed to echo louder, dragging him backward into memories he'd buried, into a past he thought money had erased. When the door finally opened, time seemed to stop. There she was, curled under a thin blanket, her small chest rising and falling in sleep. Hope. The same girl who had stood barefoot in that restaurant, staring down his arrogance, laying her hand on Mikey's lifeless legs with nothing but quiet faith. Even in rest, her presence filled the room. But then his eyes lifted, and the ground fell out from under him. Sitting beside her on a worn chair was a woman, her face gaunt, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, her eyes carrying years of battles lost and fought again. He staggered 2 steps into the room, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This can't be." And yet, as she slowly raised her head, recognition slammed into him like a wave. The years had etched themselves into her face, carved lines where laughter used to live, thinned her body until she looked breakable. But it was her, Angela, the woman he once cast aside without hesitation, without mercy. He said her name like it was a ghost returning to haunt him, and she, steady in her weariness, did not flinch, did not look surprised. She had been expecting him all along. Her face hardened before she even spoke, as if she had been holding on to this confrontation for years, waiting for him to finally arrive at the debt he had avoided. "You took long enough to recognize me," she said, her voice low but sharp. "But yes, it's me, Charles." He froze in the doorway, still half in disbelief, like his mind couldn't quite stitch the woman in front of him to the ghost of the past. He took another step forward, hesitant, his lips parting as though he were afraid of the answer he might get. "What are you doing here?" he asked, but his question trembled. And then she said it, the words that stripped the air out of the room. "She's your daughter." Angela nodded, just barely, but the gesture landed like a hammer. "Yes, that girl you threw out of the restaurant as if she were a nuisance. She's yours, just like you cast me aside once when I became inconvenient." Her words didn't need volume, they cut like glass, sharp and undeniable. Charles stumbled back a step, as though the floor had tilted beneath him. I could almost see his mind spinning, dragging him years into the past, back to the office where it had all begun. Angela had worked for him then, one of his brightest, sharpest employees. People respected her, admired her, trusted her with responsibilities others twice her age couldn't handle. She was diligent, thoughtful, steady. But when her pregnancy began to show, things changed. She was late sometimes, left early on others. Her once seamless work began to slip, and Charles, ruthless, efficient Charles, hadn't hesitated. No meeting, no compassion, no second chance. He had fired her with the same cold detachment he used to cut a failing project from his portfolio. His mouth worked now, but the words barely made it out. "I didn't know. I didn't know what you were going through. I didn't know she was mine." His voice cracked, frayed by disbelief. Angela's eyes didn't soften. They were steady, hard, like a mirror he could no longer avoid. "Of course you didn't know," she said dryly. "You didn't care to. You never looked past the numbers, past the inconvenience. You didn't see me then, and you didn't see her now, and that's why you lost both of us." The silence that followed pressed down like a weight. The child slept soundly just a few feet away, unaware of the storm circling above her. Charles stood rooted to the spot, his whole body shaking under the realization of what he had done, not just to Angela, not just to the girl, but to himself. In that moment, he wasn't the billionaire in the headlines, or the man who could bend judges and rivals to his will. He was just a man facing the ghost of his own choices, and the living proof of what he had thrown away. Because you never wanted to know. Her words landed like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading through the silence that followed. For a long moment, Charles couldn't look at her. His eyes shifted to the little girl curled beneath the thin blanket, her breathing soft, her innocence untouched by the weight of the room. His chest tightened as he realized the truth. The child he had dismissed, the one he had mocked, was his own flesh and blood. The daughter of the woman he had once discarded without hesitation. His voice, when it came, was quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost trembling. She touched my son, and he felt his legs for the first time in 5 years. And then she was gone. But she started something, Angela. I have to understand what it means. Angela crossed her arms and drew in a slow, heavy breath, her shoulders rising as if the air itself was weighted with years of silence. She looked at him with a gaze that wasn't cruel, but wasn't forgiving either. It was the gaze of someone holding both hurt and strength. "It's not about whether you want to understand," she said finally. "The question is whether you're ready to hear what you refused to hear back then." "Yes," he blurted out, desperation cracking through the word. "Please." For a moment, she didn't answer. She just sat there, her hand resting protectively near her daughter's shoulder, her lips pressed together as if deciding whether to let the dam break. And then, with her eyes still fixed on the child who had carried her through so much, she exhaled. The sound wasn't just breath, it was release, the kind that comes after years of swallowing down truth. "You want to know what happened after you fired me?" she said, her voice steady but trembling underneath. "I'll tell you. You didn't just take away my job, Charles. You took away the little safety I had left. I was pregnant and terrified, and suddenly I had nothing, no income, no health insurance, no stability. I went from being praised in your office for my efficiency and skill to being tossed out like I was disposable, and you didn't even look me in the eye when you did it." Charles lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. Shame burned across his face, the kind of shame that doesn't come from being caught, but from realizing too late what your choices have destroyed. Angela's voice grew stronger, not louder, but deeper, as though it was pulling from every scar she carried. "I couldn't find work anywhere. No one wanted to hire a woman about to give birth. I went door to door, filling out applications, swallowing my pride, and every single one ended the same way, a polite smile, a closed door. I slept on couches when I could, on church pews when I couldn't. I learned what it meant to be invisible, to beg for scraps of kindness from strangers. And all the while, you sat in your glass tower, building your empire, never wondering what became of me. I carried her while sleeping on a shelter floor, the kind of place where rats ran across the mattress at night, and you learned to tuck your blanket tight around your feet. That was my pregnancy, Charles. Not doctor's visits, not warm meals, not family checking in, just me, swollen and exhausted, lying awake in the dark with nothing but fear for company. When the time came, I gave birth in a crowded public hospital, surrounded by strangers, not a single hand to hold. I left that place sore, bleeding and terrified, and when they discharged me, I had nowhere to go. Nowhere. Just me and her, my newborn daughter, against the wind. Her voice caught, but she pressed on, steady like someone who had rehearsed this truth in her mind for years. "We ended up on the streets. Do you know what it's like to nurse a baby on a park bench in the cold, with your coat wrapped around both of you because you don't have a blanket? Do you know what it's like to watch your child cough until her tiny body shakes, and all you can do is hold her tighter and pray she makes it through the night? She fainted from hunger once, my baby, limp in my arms, because there wasn't enough food for both of us. That's the life you left us, too." Angela rubbed her face with both hands, as if trying to wipe away memories that clung too tightly. All of it started because you decided I wasn't useful anymore. My numbers slipped, my output fell, and suddenly I was nothing but a liability to you. Of course I wasn't performing like before. I was carrying a life inside me. But in your eyes, I was just a line in the red, disposable. Charles sat there, shoulders caved, his breathing ragged. He wanted to answer, I could see it. Wanted to explain, to beg, to crawl back into her forgiveness. But there are no words that can balance that scale. Nothing you can say makes a hungry child less hungry, makes years of cold nights vanish. The silence between them was heavier than any boardroom standoff he'd ever won. Angela's gaze shifted then, softening not for him, but for the memory of the child she'd raised in that chaos. She grew up without a room, without toys, without birthday cakes. But Iris always had something different. Even as a toddler, she'd look at people like she could see what they carried inside. She had this quiet presence, like she knew when someone needed help before they even spoke. She would walk up to strangers at the exact moment they needed someone, and it was never for attention, never to be noticed. It was just her. That's who she became, in spite of everything, or maybe because of everything. It's like she sees things the rest of us can't, Angela said, her voice softening as her eyes drifted toward the little girl still sleeping under the thin blanket. There was no bitterness in her tone now, only tenderness, a mother marveling at something she couldn't fully explain. One day, she noticed a man sitting on the sidewalk, his head buried in his hands, shoulders shaking. He looked like every part of him had already given up. She tugged my sleeve and whispered, "He needs help, Mama. He's sick on the inside." Before I could stop her, she walked right over and placed her tiny hand on his arm. Angela's eyes grew glassy as she remembered, and that man, he collapsed into sobs, not the quiet kind, not ashamed, but loud, gasping cries, like a child who finally allowed himself to break. He told us later he'd been ready to end his life that very night, but he didn't, because a little girl sat beside him and told him he was still good. Her voice caught for a moment, then steadied. It's happened more than once. Broken people, sick people, people so weighed down they thought they couldn't go on. She just knows. She feels what others can't put into words. There's no other way to describe it. Charles sat there, staring at his daughter as if seeing something sacred, something his wealth could never purchase or destroy. His mind was still trying to wrap around the impossible, that this child, unwanted and invisible in the world's eyes, had been carrying light enough to save strangers from the edge. And now, maybe, she had saved his own son. I could see the conflict on his face, pride and shame colliding, awe and regret twisting together until he looked like a man undone. Angela turned back to him, her expression steady, her words almost a whisper but sharp enough to pierce the air. She walked into that restaurant that night because she knew. She told me that morning she'd find someone important that day. "I'll help," she said. That's why she went. She didn't ask for money, didn't demand anything grand, just a plate of food, and not as payment, never as payment. She was testing you. Her arms folded across her chest, her chin lifting as she met his eyes directly. She wanted to know what kind of man you were, and even after all of it, even after she learned that you were the one who cast us out, left us with nothing, she still chose to help your son, because she doesn't carry hate, she doesn't hold grudges, she gave where you once took away. That's who she is. She has a purpose, Angela said, her voice low but steady, and you had a chance to see it. But instead, you pushed her away like she was some fraud. Her words landed heavy, and Charles stepped forward, his throat working as if the apology was fighting its way out from a place he hadn't used in years. His voice cracked when he spoke. I know what I did. I ruined everything. But if you'll let me, I want another chance. Not to erase the past, not to pretend it never happened, but to start over, to do it differently this time." Angela didn't answer right away. She just kept her eyes fixed on him, and for the first time that night, her gaze didn't cut like a blade. It wasn't soft, but it carried a different kind of weight, Not anger anymore, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had fought too long, carried too much, and wanted nothing more than to lay it down for a while. She didn't need grand speeches or promises. She needed proof that rest was possible. Then Charles said the words that broke the air open. "Come with me. Both of you. This isn't charity. It's not a handout. It's what you deserve. It's what I owe." The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was fragile, like a glass balancing on the edge of a table, waiting to fall one way or another. And in that silence, something shifted. Hope stirred awake in her cot, rubbing her eyes, her small face calm as though she had been listening all along. She glanced first at her mother, then at Charles, and though she was only 9 years old, her voice carried a clarity that made the adults feel small. "We can go, Mama." That was all she said, just 4 words, but the way she said them, without hesitation, without doubt, it was more powerful than any sermon, more final than any courtroom decree. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was a door cracking open where none had been before. That night, as they left the shelter behind, the city itself seemed to slow. Charles's mansion on the hill, once a monument to pride and distance, opened its doors to the people he had once cast out. And as dusk gave way to night, the sky dimmed not with certainty but with hesitation, as though even the heavens were unsure whether to allow the day to end. It was the first night in years that house held something more than wealth. It held a chance, fragile, unearned, but real. It felt strange to see him like that, softened not by wealth or status, but by something simpler, something purer. For the first time in years, that massive house of his, all sharp edges, cold stone, and echoing silence, seemed to be holding something more than money. It was holding hope. The kind of hope that makes walls less suffocating, that makes even polished marble floors seem less like barriers and more like bridges. When Angela and her daughter stepped across the wide threshold, Charles did what any host would do, though the gesture felt almost awkward coming from him. He offered to show them the rooms, to walk them through the house he had built as his fortress. But Hope simply looked up at him, her eyes calm and steady, and said, "I want to spend a little time with Mikey." Just the 2 of us, in his room. For a moment, Charles froze, surprised by the certainty in her voice. Then he nodded, a little unsteady, and stepped aside. "Of course. Make yourselves at home. I'll be right here if you need me." Hope moved with that quiet ease of hers, as if she didn't need directions, as if she already knew where to go. She didn't ask for help, didn't hesitate, didn't look back. She glided down the hallway with her bare feet pressing into Persian rugs, passing beneath gilded frames and towering chandeliers without so much as a glance. None of it touched her. Expensive art, imported furniture, carved wood and glass, all the symbols of power seemed to fade in her presence. She didn't belong to the house, but the house bent to her, softened by the weight of something it had never known before. In Mikey's room, the light was dim, the curtains drawn. He sat on the edge of his bed, shoulders slouched, staring out the window as though waiting for the night to give him answers. When the door creaked open, he didn't flinch. He didn't even turn, just breathed slower, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. Hope stepped inside carefully, her hands folded in front of her. She closed the door behind her with the gentlest click, and for a beat she stood still, like she was asking for permission without using words. "Hi," she whispered. Just one word, but the way it lingered in the air carried more weight than 100 speeches. It wasn't the hi of a stranger or the hi of a guest. It was the kind of greeting that feels like an answer to a question you didn't realize you'd been asking. And in that quiet room, with the city lights flickering outside and 2 children facing one another across the fragile distance between them, it felt like something was about to begin. Something neither of them, nor anyone else in that house, would ever be able to explain. "Hi," he answered, and there was something different in his voice, something lighter than the flat tone I'd heard before. Hope didn't climb onto the bed, didn't intrude on his space. Instead, she lowered herself onto the floor across from him, folding her legs neatly as if she had all the time in the world. For a few long seconds she didn't speak at all. She just looked at him, her gaze steady but soft, like she was studying him in a way no one else ever had. Mikey's eyes fell to his lap, his cheeks coloring with embarrassment. "My legs, they're numb again," he murmured, sadness coating every word. "It feels like they're just asleep." His voice cracked a little, and I could hear the weight of years pressed into a 9-year-old's chest. But Hope didn't flinch. She tilted her head gently, her braid sliding across her shoulder. "Sometimes the soul takes a little longer to wake up the rest of us," she said quietly, as though the idea were as natural as breathing. Then she leaned forward, took his small hands into hers, and held them with a surprising strength for someone so slight. "Do you trust me?" Mikey nodded without hesitation. "Since the restaurant," he whispered, "since the moment you looked at me." It was such a simple confession, but it hung in the air like a vow. Hope's lips curved into the faintest smile, not triumphant, but knowing, like she'd been waiting for that answer. She shifted closer, her presence calm and unwavering, and then with absolute serenity, she laid both hands on his knees. She closed her eyes, said nothing more, and let the silence take over the room. The house outside was vast and quiet, the gardens cloaked in moonlight that poured pale silver through the window. Inside his room, there was only the sound of 2 children breathing, the weight of anticipation pressing against the walls. And then, slowly, so subtly at first it could have been imagined, something shifted. Mikey's eyes widened. He gasped softly, his breath stuttering. "It's happening again," he whispered, his voice breaking with awe. At first it was just warmth, a gentle heat spreading through his thighs, then a pressure, then something deeper, like a spark of life rekindling itself where it had long been gone. Hope stayed silent, her palms resting steady, her face serene, as though her very being was pouring into him. Mikey's body trembled, his chest heaved as he sucked in air. His toes twitched under the blanket, a single involuntary spasm that made him cry out in wonder. His calf muscle shivered, quivering with a life he hadn't felt in half a decade. He pressed his own hands onto his legs, desperate to feel, to confirm it wasn't some cruel dream. And when he did, when the sensation met his touch, his lips parted in disbelief and his eyes filled with tears too big for a boy his age. "It tingles," he whispered, his voice breaking with disbelief. "Really, it's so strong right now." His small hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white, and I could see the fight in him, the stubborn determination of a boy who had waited 5 years for this one impossible chance. He pressed his feet against the floor, first one, then the other. The wood creaked beneath him, the sound so ordinary and yet so extraordinary it made my chest tighten. Slowly, painfully, his body began to push upward. Hope stayed perfectly still, her gaze locked on him, her face calm, almost serene, as if her presence alone was anchoring him. And then it happened. Mikey rose, trembling, swaying, his legs shaking like branches in a storm. But he was standing. For the first time in 5 years, that boy was on his own 2 feet. His eyes widened, his breath came in sharp bursts, and he kept repeating the words as though saying them out loud might keep them real. "I'm standing. I'm standing." Hope's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You're waking up," she told him softly, her voice steady but filled with warmth. "Inside and out. Your body just needed to be reminded that it still remembers how to walk." There was no drama in her tone, no performance. Just truth, spoken as easily as if she were pointing out the weather. Mikey's tears spilled freely now, and he clutched at the air as if he were learning how to balance, his arms spread wide like wings ready to take flight. The door creaked open, and there was Charles. He had been waiting outside, honoring her request to give them space. But when he stepped in and saw his son upright, his body trembling but holding, the sight shattered him. He didn't shout, didn't gasp, didn't even speak at first. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor with a thud that seemed to shake the whole house. And then came the tears, not the restrained kind men allow themselves in rare moments, but deep, raw sobs that tore through him, quiet but unstoppable. He crawled toward his boy, touching his legs, his torso, his face, as if needing to confirm each piece of the miracle with his own hands. "You're walking," he whispered again and again, like the words might dissolve if he stopped saying them. Mikey cried too, but through the tears came a smile so wide it split his face with joy. "She's a superhero, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "She woke me up inside." And there stood Hope, quiet, watchful, her face free of pride or need for praise. She simply bore witness, as though her only role was to be there at the right time. In that room, where doctors, therapists, and endless experts had failed, a barefoot girl had done what no one else could. There were no cameras, no applause, no audience to bear witness. Only the quiet pulse of faith, holding that room together. Charles was still on his knees when Mikey, wobbling on unsteady legs, reached out and took his hand. With short, fragile steps, the boy helped his father to his feet. It wasn't strength that lifted Charles that night. It was the miracle standing inside his child's body, the light shining through his eyes. For once, it was the son holding up the father. Charles wiped at his face, his fingers clumsy, his chest heaving as if he couldn't catch his breath. Words tangled in his throat. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to fall at her feet and promise her the world. But when he looked across the room, Hope was sitting quietly in the corner, legs folded beneath her, calm as a still pond. There was no pride on her face, no giddy excitement, no triumph. Just that deep, steady calm, as though to her, this was never the end of anything, only the beginning. Hours later, they gathered in the grand living room, a space that had always felt like a museum more than a home. Charles's hands shook as he poured water into crystal glasses, the simplest task suddenly monumental. Angela sat on the couch, her arm draped protectively around her daughter, her eyes flicking from Hope to Mikey as if she still couldn't trust what she'd seen. Mikey lay among the pillows, smiling, not with the nervous grin of a child performing, but with the steady confidence of someone who had reclaimed something stolen long ago. He rested with ease, like his body was learning again what it meant to belong to him. Charles paced from one side of the room to the other, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. He couldn't sit still, couldn't stop the storm of words building inside him. For years he had controlled boardrooms with speeches, dictated fates with a flick of his hand. But here, in his own house before these three souls, he felt stripped bare, searching for a language he had never learned. His chest rose and fell, his fingers twitching like he needed to hold on to something solid, anything that might ground him in this new reality. And in that silence, it was clear. This wasn't about business, or reputation, or saving face. This was about trying to become a man who deserved to be in the same room as the people who had saved his son. He had to speak, had to move, had to find some gesture worthy of the miracle they had been given. And yet, with every step, he realized nothing he could offer would ever be enough. "I don't even know how to thank you," Charles finally said, his voice breaking the heavy stillness. His hands were trembling as he spoke, like every word was being pried loose from somewhere deep inside him. "You've changed everything, truly. I spent my whole life trying to control the world with money, with influence, with power, and none of it worked. None of it gave me what I wanted most." His eyes flicked between Angela and her daughter, raw with something I had never seen in him before, humility. "But the two of you made the impossible happen." Angela listened quietly, but her gaze didn't waver from Hope. It was as if she already knew where the real answer would come from. Charles pressed forward, his voice more urgent now, words tumbling over each other. "I don't want to just say thank you. I want to act. I'll give you everything you need, a home where you feel safe, the security you deserve, Angela, and the career you were denied. And for Hope, the best schools, every opportunity I can provide. Everything in my power, I'll give it to you both. You deserve the whole world." The words hung in the air, glistening with sincerity. And for a moment, the silence felt almost tender. Then Hope's voice cut through it, soft yet unshakable, like sunlight piercing a closed window. "We'll accept your help." Charles exhaled, shoulders slumping in relief, the beginnings of a smile twitching at his mouth. But before he could let it grow, she went on, "But it isn't enough." The room shifted at once. Her words didn't match her small frame, yet they carried more weight than anything Charles had said all night. He frowned, startled, as though he'd misheard. "What do you mean? Not enough?" His tone wasn't defensive, just confused, almost frightened. And then Hope looked straight into him. Not at him, not past him, but into him, as if she could see the marrow of who he was. There was no anger in her gaze, no arrogance, only clarity, the kind that makes you feel exposed. "You have to change for real," she said, steady and calm, every syllable deliberate. "Not just to help us. Not just to feel better about what happened. You have to become the kind of man who never hurts anyone else the way you hurt us. You have to change because it's who you choose to be, not because you're trying to erase the past." Her words settled over the room like a judgment and a promise at once, and for the first time, Charles Davenport, the man who once made judges tremble and rivals scatter, sat perfectly still, listening to a 9-year-old girl teach him what it meant to be human. Charles froze as though he were standing before a court no one else could see, a place where the jury was invisible, but the verdict already written on his heart. Mikey eased himself upright on the couch, his eyes locked on his father, not with fear or resentment, but with quiet expectation, like he too was waiting to see what kind of man would stand before them now. Angela stayed silent, her expression unreadable, giving the moment room to breathe. "You have so much, Mr. Davenport," Hope said, her voice calm but cutting. "You have power, a voice, influence, but if all of that is only used to protect yourself, to keep the world the same, then it's worthless." She didn't raise her voice, didn't lecture. She simply stated it, matter of fact, like naming the sky or the ocean. "You need to teach your son what goodness looks like. Show him that people make mistakes, but they can fix them. Show him that money isn't just for building walls. It can lift up the people who've fallen down. And show him that regret isn't just a feeling. It has to become action." Her words weren't flowery, weren't complicated, but they landed with the weight of truth. They peeled something open inside Charles, and for once he didn't try to patch it up with excuses or armor. His eyes dropped to the floor because he knew it was true, because he had always known, somewhere deep in the parts of himself he had ignored. He had spent his whole life in rooms full of men who told him what he wanted to hear, and now a child was telling him what he needed to hear. "You're right," he said finally, his voice raw, trembling like it hadn't in years. "For the first time in my life, someone is saying this to my face, and I understand." The room held its breath, and then Hope rose from her chair and crossed the space between them. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She reached for his hand and wrapped her small fingers around his, holding him steady, the way she had steadied his son. "Your son has started to walk again," she said, her tone gentle but certain. "Now it's your turn." And with that, she let his hand go. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a vow that what happened in that room would demand more than gratitude, more than gifts. It demanded transformation. The future was still shapeless, uncertain. But in that moment, Charles understood something he had spent his whole life running from. It wasn't enough to fix the present. He had to reckon with the past. He had to repair it not with words, but with action. Maybe, if he worked hard enough, he could become the kind of man his son would be proud to stand beside. The kind of man who didn't flinch at his own reflection. Hope's words had struck him not as a suggestion, but as a command, quiet yet absolute. This wasn't about charity. It was about restitution. In the days that followed, the first steps were hesitant, but they were real. He turned inward, beginning with the empire he had built like a fortress. His company had been his kingdom, cold, rigid, unyielding. Now it would have to be the place where change began. He summoned his directors, filled the conference hall with men and women who had once feared his presence. He asked for lists, records, reports. He demanded to know the names of those who had been dismissed under questionable reasons. The employees discarded the way he had once discarded Angela. For the first time, the silence in that room didn't belong to fear, but to shock. "I want every case reviewed," he told them, his voice firm but stripped of its old arrogance. "I want to find everyone who was treated unfairly here, and I want to look them in the eye." Those words rolled through the hall like thunder, and the room, once his arena of intimidation, now became the stage for something no one had expected. Whispers traveled faster than memos. By the next day, the news had spread like wildfire through every corridor, every cubicle. The man who had ruled with iron silence was tearing his own walls down. It was like a shockwave moving through the building. Employees who used to lower their eyes when he passed now lifted their heads, watching him closely, not with fear, but with a cautious kind of respect. Some didn't trust it, not yet. Others wanted to believe. He saw it in their faces, curiosity, suspicion, a spark of hope they didn't dare name. It was the beginning of something fragile, something that could collapse if he faltered. But Charles was steady now, steadier than he had ever been. And he didn't stop there. The company was only the first layer. What he had to face stretched beyond offices and boardrooms, beyond profit and loss. It stretched into the lives of the people he had cast aside, the families he had wounded, the communities he had ignored. This wasn't about salvaging reputation or soothing his conscience anymore. It was about building something new, something that proved his son's miracle wasn't wasted. It was about answering a little girl's command, to change, for real. Charles began by stripping away the excess he had once worn like armor. He pulled the profits from the last decade, combed through his investments, and redirected streams of wealth he had once hoarded. He sold off indulgences that no longer meant anything and funneled millions into programs for single mothers, shelters, and clinics. There were no headlines, no stage photographs, no press releases. He didn't want applause. For the first time in his life, his giving wasn't about being seen. It was about doing what should have been done all along. Mikey was with him most of the time. The boy, still shaky on his legs but walking nonetheless, became his shadow and his conscience. They visited shelters with cracked windows and peeling paint, clinics where lines of weary faces stretched out the door, schools where teachers stretched pennies into lessons. Mikey's eyes took everything in, wide and curious, and he asked questions his father struggled to answer. "Why are these kids sleeping on mats instead of beds?" he asked once, his small hand tugging at Charles's sleeve. "Why don't some of them have parents? Why do they look so tired?" Each question landed heavier than the last, and Charles found himself fumbling for words. Sometimes he tried to explain, about poverty, about systems that failed, about choices no child should have to live with. Other times, he just listened, realizing that silence could be an answer too, if it left room for understanding. For a man who had spent decades lecturing, commanding, deciding, it was a shock to find himself learning instead. He learned from the lines on tired mothers' faces. He learned from the way teachers bent close to whisper encouragement into children's ears. He learned from his son, who looked at injustice not with cynicism, but with an earnest demand. Why is the world like this, and why haven't we fixed it yet? It was the first time in years Charles wasn't the teacher. He was the student. One evening, after a visit to a nonprofit that cared for children with disabilities, Mikey slipped his hand into his father's and asked quietly, "Dad, we're going to keep doing this, right?" And there, standing in the dim light of a parking lot, Charles felt something break open in him. Not guilt, not shame, but hope. For once, he didn't hesitate. He knelt down, looked his son in the eyes, and said, "Yes, as long as we're breathing, we'll keep going." Charles looked at his son, tears clouding his vision, and whispered, "For the rest of our lives, son. This is what we live for now." and they did. Those words became the compass for everything that followed. Together, father and son launched a rehabilitation program for children, offering free physical therapy where once there had been only waiting lists and impossible costs. They expanded shelters that had been overflowing, places where hope usually came in small doses if it came at all. Within his own company, Charles rewrote the rules. He offered scholarships to young people who would never have dreamed of stepping into higher education. He added clauses into hiring contracts, mandating reserved positions for single mothers rebuilding their lives. These weren't token gestures or shallow philanthropy. They were bricks in a foundation he should have laid long ago, pieces of a man he was finally becoming. Not a different man, but the man he should have been from the beginning. And yet, through it all, there was the quiet presence of the girl who had started it. Sometimes, in the middle of community meetings or during site visits to projects that bore his name, Charles would catch himself looking at Mikey, and then his thoughts would drift to Hope. She asked for nothing. She never sought applause. She didn't try to stand in the spotlight. She simply stayed close to her mother, watching, listening, learning. But her presence was undeniable, like a current moving under the surface, steady and unstoppable. It became clearer with every passing week. The transformation had started with her. It radiated outward in circles too vast to measure. People noticed, neighbors, employees, strangers. They saw the shift in him, and they felt the difference in their own lives. Journalists picked up the story, digging for angles, searching for cracks. Some colleagues in business dismissed him, mocked him, whispered that this was just an old wolf pretending to change his stripes. Others criticized, doubted, rolled their eyes. But Charles didn't care. For once, he wasn't chasing their approval. For the first time in his life, his reputation wasn't measured in numbers, profits, or power plays. It was measured in something far more valuable: the lives he touched, the hands he lifted, the children who stood where once they couldn't. And he knew, deep down, that it all began with a little girl who had looked him in the eye, stripped him of his excuses, and asked for nothing but a chance to prove what love could do. He found meaning now in the smallest gestures: a handshake that lingered, a home rebuilt, the spark of hope rekindled in a stranger's eyes. That morning, the sun seemed too bright, almost intentional, as if the world itself had slowed down to let this moment take shape. Charles pulled the car to a stop in front of a modest, single-story house. Its walls were freshly painted, wide windows catching the light, a small garden out front alive with the color of newly planted flowers. It wasn't grand, it wasn't ostentatious, but it breathed peace. In the back seat, Angela and Hope exchanged puzzled glances, their eyes drifting out the window as if trying to guess where he had brought them. Beside him, Mikey grinned wide, his excitement too big for his small body, his legs shifting restlessly as if they knew the secret already. "Where are we?" Angela asked, her brow furrowed. Charles stepped out of the car, walked around to the other side, and opened the door for them. The gesture carried no arrogance, no entitlement, only respect, almost ceremonial in its quietness. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice soft but certain. "This belongs to you." They followed him, hesitant but curious, until they stood at the front gate, and there, with hands that shook only slightly, Charles held out a set of keys. "This house was built for you," he said, his voice catching in his throat. "Every wall, every corner, every detail, it's yours. Not as charity, not as a handout, but because you deserve a place where your story is honored, a place to begin again." Angela's eyes widened, her lips parting as though words had been stolen from her. For a long beat she couldn't speak at all. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the gate, then the grain of the wooden door, as if to test whether it was real. And in that silence, in that fragile pause, it became clear. This wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of one written differently. Not in shame or in exile, but in dignity, in belonging, in a kind of love that had finally learned how to take root. There were no accusations left to make, no bitterness lingering in the air, only a quiet acknowledgement, spoken by someone who had seen a seed planted and now stood watching its fruit ripen. Mikey walked up to Hope, his steps still a little uncertain, but carried by a strength that had returned, and he slipped his hand into hers. His eyes sparkled as he whispered, "You're like a spark, you know? You light people up from the inside." Hope's smile was small, gentle, but it carried the weight of wisdom beyond her years. "We just have to remind people of who they were," she said softly, "before they forgot." Her words seemed to linger in the room, not as a command, not as a lesson, but as a truth too simple and too profound to argue with. Charles stood there, breathing deeply, looking first to the sky through the wide new windows, then back to the girl who had undone him, healed him, freed him. He pulled Angela into an embrace, not the hurried kind of a man trying to erase guilt, but one of respect, a recognition of what she had endured and what she had built on her own. Then he turned to Hope and drew her into his arms with gratitude, not ownership. For once there was no power in his hold, only thanks. The four of them stood together in that space, not as pieces of a broken past, but as a small, fragile circle gathered in silence. In the new home built on the ruins of old mistakes, something came to an end, and something far greater began. It wasn't wealth that had created it, nor influence, nor status. It was the discovery of the true worth of people, the humility to admit failure, and the faith to believe in change. And it all began with a little girl who had walked into a restaurant, barefoot and unafraid, and asked for nothing more than a plate of food in exchange for a miracle. Maybe that's what life is really about. Not the power we hold, not the wealth we chase, but the moments when we choose to see each other, to lift each other, to believe again in what seemed lost. One girl with nothing but courage reminded a man with everything that the heart is worth more than gold, and that change is possible no matter how far you've fallen. And if that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. And now I want to hear from you. Did this story move you the way it moved me? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I promise I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button if you felt something stir inside you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes all it takes is one spark, one story, to remind us of who we are before we forget.